I wrote this book, Birth Matters, on the suggestion from a young editor that's at the publisher, Seven Stories Press. And I've learned, in the last decade or two, that it's a good thing to follow the suggestions of someone in their 20s who's really interested in birth. So I followed her suggestion. She says, why don't you write a manifesta? And I said, oh, that sounds like something I would like to write. And she kind of provided me with, well, hit on this, this, and this, and this. And I thought, okay, I'll do it. And then as I worked with the manuscript and she read it, she says, well, why don't you tackle this, this, and this? And I said, okay, do you know what you're suggesting here? This is going to really sort of throw some things up in the air that people aren't used to. But what she was, this is not written for people having babies so much as their relatives and friends who think that maybe they're crazy to consider a birth in a birth center or giving birth without having every high-tech intervention done for safety reasons. That's what she wanted to explain to family and friends, that she wasn't crazy for wanting to be a midwife, and to look at what's it like if we give birth without all these interventions and only save the interventions for when they're needed and not use them as a matter of routine. I also wanted people to understand how much birth matters, because it sort of happens in those places out of our view. It's in private settings, and I think we in the US are actually very superstitious about birth. We're in fact superstitious about the use of technology, and in the sense that we think technology is better than nature. And we forget that while we can do some high-tech things that improve eyesight, and we think of, cataract surgery and lens, artificial lenses and things like that to replace messed up lenses that we have, or we've got technology about the heart, and you've got people with triple and quadruple bypasses, and it makes us think that you can do things to the uterus and the vagina that in fact you can't do. Sorry, we can't improve on nature there. We actually have to consider some laws of nature in birth. And I'd say one of the big laws is that you don't harass or make a laboring mother uncomfortable, because this can actually cause complications. We don't usually think of that, We think, oh, nature always goes wrong. Nature doesn't always go wrong, or I wouldn't be sitting here today. Because before I became a midwife, I had never seen a birth, but I knew that birth could happen. I'd never even seen a photograph of birth, but I knew that birth could happen because I was a farmer's daughter. And even though I'd never seen it, I knew it happened with all the other species, and I didn't happen to think that the human species was inferior to the other mammalian species. Women who want to have an unmedicated birth and give birth in a hospital have an increasingly small chance of actually achieving that result. And I think it's because in hospitals today, the routines have narrowed to the point where it's pretty hard to get that. And part of it is because, there's a lot of different reasons, okay? But let's just say that the routines are such that now you come into the hospital, and in most units, you're going to go straight away, you're going to have an IV put in your arm. Now that's going to make you uncomfortable because it hurts. And even when you get an epidural, that IV in your arm is still going to hurt. It's going to keep you from wanting to move, because the more you move, the more it hurts, and you can't get in different positions. Now, why does that IV have to be in your arm? Well, you're not going to be allowed probably to have a drink. So it's the way you're drinking now through your arm. And chances are very, very high that you're going to be placed on your back, because that's the way that the electronic fetal heart monitor can best pick up signals from your baby's heartbeat. That makes it look like, should this case ever end up in court, it'll look like somebody's been with you and keeping track of your baby's welfare every second of your labor. This ignores the fact that if you had somebody with you continuously, let's call that person a midwife, but it used to be a labor and delivery nurse would be with you in most hospitals quite a lot of the time, but now we don't have the staffing of labor and delivery nurses, so much so that we have enough of them that they can spend much time with a woman. So more typically, they're just going to be making sure that that electronic fetal heart monitor is in place or that your IV is flowing well. So now you've got mom in the most ineffectual position for labor, lying flat on her back. It's also extremely boring, let me say, okay? Now, if she's up and moving around, all laboring mammals are going to be typically moving in labor. Why? Because they're obeying the body signals that want them to move. Often this movement helps get the baby into the right position so that it can come out most easily. But if she's lying flat there, baby that's not already in an optimum position going to stay in a non-optimal position, and now it's more likely that she's going to have some kind of an instrumental delivery or a C-section, simply because she's not moving around. She also is missing the preparation for motherhood that labor can be. I've just watched this, two births this last week. You go deep into yourself when you're in labor, and you discover things about yourself that you may not have known before. You could even be learning these things on birth 2 or 3 or 4 that will impact your life forever and make you a stronger person, a more courageous person sometimes. And I'm not saying that women who undergo C-section aren't brave. I think you have to be kind of brave even just to get through a C-section. Myself, that would have scared me, and that's where I would have had to summon my courage. But I'm just saying that to learn how your body hormones work, I think, is pretty important for us mothers when we can, that we have a solid group of women, those who are already aimed for that say, look, I don't want to minimize this experience. I want to experience it and all of its mystery, okay? And what women learn is that their own attitudes and what they pay attention to during labor actually affects the course of their labor. And if they're focused in on what if this and what if that and looking at the clock, it doesn't work as well and they'll be a little more anxious. But if they go into, well, maybe sometimes they discover if I sing, it makes me feel better. Or if let's say if I'm in some water and I'm moving gently and I'm sort of moving my hips around, it seems like things are going better. Or if I'm don't have a lot of people popping in the room, because that inhibits me and that puts me in a more anxious state of mind. But when that person left, suddenly it got a lot better. Or when my partner started rubbing my back and just touched that place, then it really helped and it really made me grateful to him, and then he kind of knew what to do from then on. These are life lessons that are going to impact that relationship and that woman and her feeling and her partner's feeling about the baby. So what do I mean about hormones? I mean, we ideally, labor these would be calm settings. It wouldn't be like emergency room, that sort of high pressure, oh, let's all act like we're panicked and that means that we're good caregivers because we're responding to danger and you have that high stress level. That is not conducive to birth in any species, okay? But somehow we think that there's this human exceptionalism and that we don't obey the rules that govern all mammals, which is you got to be relaxed to give birth, and that you can actually cause complications by introducing stress to the surroundings of a laboring mammal. Any child on a farm learns the worst thing you can do is go bother any mammal in labor. Okay, so we don't want adrenaline to be the hormone that's happening in the laboring mother. And so how do we make that go away? We want the calm hormone, which is oxytocin, and it doesn't just come in little vials, it's actually produced by the body itself, but not when the mother is in a state of fear and anxiety. It happens when there's somebody who's reducing her fears, who's actually helping her laugh, or to breathe deeply, or to move into a position where she feels better. Now her body's producing the hormones that make her calm, that actually make her labor progress without having the oxytocin from another species synthesized coming in to her arm via the IV. And it actually produces states of mind at the same time it makes the uterine contractions go well that get her euphoric, that cause her to go into an ecstatic state. And this, when you have an ecstatic state, it helps the baby's heart rate, and then when birth happens, you get fewer perineal injuries, you get a baby in better condition, less likely to be stressed and having a hard time breathing. When the baby is squeezed and pushed out of the body in the natural way and not being pulled into the body by its head, you're less likely to have these injuries, and you're less likely to have the baby's lungs still wet from birth. Now, when you have a C-section, you have a much higher incidence of babies whose spongy lungs, right? They're made of a very spongy tissue, and they're also often quite waterlogged in a cesarean birth because the action of the body has not squeezed these fluids out through the birth process. And so these babies are much more likely to end up in the neonatal intensive care unit because they have respiratory problems, simply because they didn't undergo the natural processes of the body that's involved in vaginal birth. Now, what else about the ecstatic state? It's important because once the baby's born, we're not just trying to get the baby out of the woman's body, we want now the baby to remain with the mother in every case possible, place skin to skin and belly to belly with the mother. This prevents hemorrhage in the mother. It promotes good heart rhythm for the baby and good respiration also. It allows the baby to clear its own breathing passages. And since it's not being held over on its back, the baby doesn't have to now be suctioned with, a syringe or some such thing, which is, babies don't like that, okay? And yes, we're able to do that when necessary, but it's much better if you allow the baby, when possible, to do that for itself, okay? And then you'll have a quicker time generally for the placenta to be born, and now probably the baby's going to find its way to the breast. Now you have a good relationship already started because the parents are not doubting the baby's survival abilities. They're often surprised to say, well, the baby actually found the breast on its own and latched on, and I didn't have to have a course in how it's done. And I go, yeah, your baby is actually as smart as a newborn hamster, rabbit, what have you. We don't think that all these other mammals have to go to courses to figure out how to nurture the baby, but only in our species do we routinely take the baby to another location. And then when we finally get them back together, guess what? They tend to have some problems because there is this state of ecstasy that both mother and baby can be in when the hormonal response is at its peak. And when you allow nature to take its course at the right time, things go much more easily.
Statistics.
Okay, so I think here we are, one of the 4 countries in the world that has not seen a decrease in the maternal mortality rate in the last years. We're seeing a rather sharp increase, in fact. Now, why are we there with Afghanistan? And the two other countries that have seen a little increase are Canada and Norway. But these aren't statistically significant. Ours is statistically significant. Why are we there? Oh, well, could be that we're not even thinking about the welfare of mothers as much as we should. Okay, that's part of it. Now, we are the country that tends to blame what's wrong in birth on midwives and on home birth, on out-of-hospital birth. This is wrong, because we have never had in the late 20th century and the 21st century, we don't have enough out-of-hospital births to account for the rise in the maternal death rate. And we're also seeing the neonatal death rate going up. So we have the important indicators are going the wrong way in this country, and it can't be the fault of out-of-hospital birth. Okay, so now that means we have to look deeper and go beyond our accepted mythologies, okay? That it's irresponsible people trying to get their own little selfish enjoyment out of labor, and that this is the problem. Okay, now we are seeing an increase in home birth, and for some good reasons. I think that the business of being born and the other film, Orgasmic Birth, are partly responsible for that, because they took a look at what's going on with the numbers, what's going on with the evidence that nature itself is so screwed up that somehow women can't give birth and we just have to do it in hospitals. Apparently that's not quite working out as we are told. What's the difference between us and the countries that have much, much lower maternal death rates and lower rates of newborn? Well, they have lots more midwives than we do. In fact, all of these countries have way more midwives than they have obstetricians and gynecologists. So maybe we should look at that. That would be different, because even though we have more midwives now than we did in 1970, we've never really been much over 10% of all the births attended by midwives. And now that's actually not going up, even though we're seeing a slight rise in the home births. It's still, that brings us up to 1% from 0.5%. And we had that rate decline in the 90s, so we're only back now to the place we were in 1989. So no big change there, okay, just a slight indication. But what we are seeing more of is a lot more C-sections. We see a tremendous number of inductions, and C-sections when you get too many of them, inductions when you get too many of them, actually can not only hurt the baby, they can hurt the mother. They can be fatal to both. So that's a case of too much of a good thing. That is, you can have dangers from not enough inductions, and you can have dangers from not enough C-sections, but then those numbers still should be rather low. The World Health Organization says that when you get above 15%, and this is in women that are high risk of C-section, okay, now you're going to lose some mothers because you're doing too many C-sections. And when you have more than, say, 10% rate of inductions, the same thing can happen. So we're seeing this, that we're almost left the mother out of the equation. And we're watching our maternal death rate go high, sharply high in some places. Let me give you a for instance. In California, between 1996 and 2006, the maternal death rate tripled. No other country has seen this, okay? And so there's a case of it. Seems to be we're having too many C-sections in California. Some women are paying for that with their lives. What can they die from? Pulmonary embolism after C-section. I find so many people tell me that on discharge, women aren't told the symptoms of a deep vein thrombosis, a DVT, okay? That you'll have a pain in the leg or a hot spot on the leg. People don't know that that could kill them. And so if you're not told that, and you're not issued sort of on your discharge information that if you've got a pain in your leg, you better get to the hospital right away because you're going to need blood thinners, something like that. This is a treatable condition. But I can't even tell you how many husbands I've talked to whose wives have died from something like that, and they said it was never mentioned to us. So there's a problem. We also can have, from induction, amniotic fluid embolism deaths. The incidence has gone up. And unfortunately, we don't have the infrastructure in our system here in the US so that we can study why deaths happen. I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day who said we had a death after an amnio infusion caused an amniotic fluid embolism death in a mother of a perfectly healthy woman. And they said, now, can we find out? We think that's what caused it, but that's not been ascertained yet. You're going to study it. And they said, now, are we going to be given the results of the study because the staff wants to know? This was very upsetting for us. And they said, no, we're not going to tell you anything. And they said, but how are we going to prevent the next one if we don't get to know? What are the results of your inquiry? So I understand why hospitals want to protect themselves from medical malpractice lawsuits, but in other countries they do that by legislation, and they'll say that their inquiries will be protected from legal discovery, and they make it confidential, but they do study why did that woman die, or why did that woman almost die, because we don't want, if we're making errors, we don't want to repeat them. That's what we need, but we don't have it now in the US. We need to make it be there. What's in this book? There's a lot of stuff in here that's not in my other books. That it's, well, you know, a pregnant couple can find stuff in here that will be useful for them to know. But this is to explain to everybody why it's important how women give birth and why we actually need to have out-of-hospital birth in every society to inform us of women's capacities in birth. I want people to understand my story of how I, with a master's degree in English, could move into midwifery and succeed, not just from luck of meeting some doctors that were helpful to me, but because I actually knew something from my experience, not from what I got necessarily from my English classes, but because I learned how to, from my own life experience and from what I knew from having a farmer dad. Even though I didn't grow up on a farm, I knew farm people. And so I had a kind of common sense where you couldn't tell me that forceps would make birth better, okay? And that it should be mandatory for every firstborn to be born by forceps. And yet, how could that have been the obstetric dogma of the 60s and the 70s and have most of obstetricians really following that with non-critical thinking going on there? I mean, they weren't analyzing how could our species be that messed up. And then you take that same mindset, and now we have C-section is the new forceps delivery, you could say. And so a lot of people go through obstetrics and never have a chance to see how that same woman could have labored if you didn't apply all this sort of fear to her. If you didn't know that your very own mindset when you enter the room can make it hard for a woman to labor in your presence, and that you're just leaving could make it a lot easier for her. Because if you enter and you're full of fear, then she's going to feel that in discomfort, pain, and it might even just stop her labor. Now, in it here, you're going to learn some of the obstetric beliefs that turn out to be myths. And you're going to learn a little history of why, you know, birth, I call it a feminist issue, because that I think that a lot of second wave feminism got wrong because they said, look, let's just don't even look at motherhood. It's just too messy a subject. That's a trap for women. And I went, no, no, no. Any feminism that doesn't include mothers is I'm sorry, that's too narrow. You've got to include these difficult issues of pregnancy, motherhood, and so on. because otherwise you're going to be thinking in crazy ways that actually endanger women. The kinds of reproductive technologies with no standards on them that can get grandmas pregnant, maybe with twins. What's that going to do to grandma's lifespan? I'm sorry, that's a big, uncontrolled biological experiment that we're making, and we don't know what the results are. And so you have lots of choice there, but you have almost no choice when you want to have an unmedicated birth with people who would be competent to take care of you in the setting where you would be most comfortable. Women who want to give birth in hospital should be able to do so in atmospheres which are protected and which are cognizant of those factors that affect labor the way we know in out-of-hospital settings.